Ancient Egypt, a land of powerful gods, sacred rivers, and eternal pyramids, is often remembered for its monumental achievements and scientific advancement. However, behind the rigidity of its stone colossuses and the seriousness of its funeral rituals, there was a world deeply rooted in pleasure, lust, and practices that today would be considered sins or taboos. Since the dawn of this civilization, sexuality was celebrated as a gift from the gods. The fundamental myth of Egyptian religion, the myth of Isis and Osiris, already reveals the importance of desire and fertility. Isis, desperate for the death and dismemberment of Osiris, gathered his scattered pieces but could not find his penis. So she sculpted a golden phallus with which she conceived Horus. This myth is not only a story about love and rebirth, but an explicit demonstration of the valorization of sex as a creative and spiritual force. Unlike many later cultures, which associated sex with sin and guilt, the Egyptians viewed sexual pleasure as a fundamental element of cosmic harmony, represented by Maat. Carnal pleasures were seen as a natural and essential part of life, and should be lived intensely, but within the balance established by the gods. Archaeological records confirm this view. Paintings and reliefs found in tombs and temples show scenes of couples in intimate positions, embracing, kissing, or simply celebrating the beauty of the human body. The famous erotic papyrus of Turin, dating from the Ramesside period, contains illustrations that are considered pornographic by today's standards, but which, for the Egyptians, were natural expressions of human sexuality. In religious festivals, lust and pleasure were indispensable elements. During the festival of Min, the god of fertility and virility, processions carried enormous phalluses raised high through the streets, while priestesses and women danced in sensual costumes, stimulating the fertility of the land and people. These rituals not only represented the creative power of nature, but also legitimized the central role of sexuality in the perpetuation of society. Another notable example was the cult of Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, and pleasure. Temples dedicated to her were the stage for festivals, where wine flowed freely, music was played by skilled dancers, and sensory ecstasy was considered a form of connection with the divine. In these celebrations, men and women indulged in provocative dances, lascivious songs, and often intimate encounters that were seen as part of the praise of the goddess. Daily life in ancient Egypt also reflected this uninhibited view of sexuality. Clothing, especially among the upper classes, was designed to enhance the beauty of the body. Transparent and tight-fitting garments were common among both men and women. Cosmetics were widely used, not only for aesthetic purposes, but also as aphrodisiacs and elements of seduction. The perfume of the blue lily, known as the blue lotus, was considered a potent sexual stimulant and was widely used in romantic encounters. The presence of brothels in the main cities of ancient Egypt is another indication of the normalization of lust. Although there was no formal regulation of prostitution, its practice was tolerated and, in certain contexts, even revered. Many prostitutes played the roles of priestesses or sacred dancers associated with religious cults that involved sexual practices as a means of worship or spiritual purification. In Egyptian literature, lust also finds a prominent place. Wisdom texts guide young men on how to seduce and please their partners, while love poems express desire and sensual pleasure with lyrical richness. One of the most beautiful examples is the Song of the Harp, which exhorts the living to enjoy earthly pleasures, since death is certain and life is short. Bathe in perfumes, dress in fine linen, enjoy music and dance, love whomever your heart desires. The role of women in this context is especially significant. Far from being relegated to submission, as was the case in many later cultures, Egyptian women enjoyed relative sexual and legal freedom. They could own property, divorce, and choose their partners. Women were admired not only for their beauty, but also for their intelligence and social skills. Many assumed positions of power, including as cult priestesses, where sensuality was part of their duties. However, despite this open and celebratory view of sexuality, there were limits imposed by the social and religious order. Adultery, for example, was condemned, especially when committed by a wife against her husband. This crime could result in severe punishments, ranging from amputation to death, depending on the severity and the social position of those involved. However, among the upper classes, especially in the royal court, the rules were more flexible, and extramarital relations often took place under the guise of political convenience or the pursuit of pleasure. The royal harem is perhaps the ultimate expression of the institutionalization of lust in ancient Egypt. Composed of dozens or hundreds of women, including wives, concubines, and servants, the harem was not only a space for pleasure for the pharaoh, but also a political instrument. The birth of a child by a concubine could alter the balance of succession and generate bloody disputes for power. Thus, the harem was both a symbol of the pharaoh's virility and a stage for palace intrigues driven by desire and ambition. The figure of the pharaoh, in fact, was deeply linked to the idea of sexual potency. His virility was considered a direct reflection of his ability to govern and maintain cosmic order. For this reason, many kings had images of themselves sculpted with youthful and vigorous faces, extolling their strength and beauty even when they were already old or ill. This idealization of the sovereign's body and sexuality was essential to reinforce his divine image in the eyes of the people. Even in death, lust found its place in the Egyptian imagination. The tombs of nobles and pharaohs often contained representations of scenes of pleasure and festivities, expressing the desire that the deceased could continue to enjoy earthly pleasures in the afterlife. Belief in the continuity of existence beyond the grave led the Egyptians to value life's pleasures intensely, but also to prepare themselves to perpetuate them into eternity. The judgment of the soul in the court of Osiris, one of the pillars of Egyptian funerary belief, did not condemn the simple enjoyment of earthly pleasures, but rather the excesses that violated Ma'at, the cosmic order. Thus, lust was not, in itself, a sin, but could become condemnable if it led to injustice, violence, or the destruction of social harmony. This balance between the celebration of pleasure and the need to maintain order reveals a remarkable sophistication in the Egyptian view of sin and lust. It was not a question of repressing natural desires, but of integrating them consciously and responsibly into personal and community life. By analyzing this perspective, we are led to reflect on modern conceptions of morality and sexuality. In a world where many cultures still associate lust with guilt and sin, the example of ancient Egypt offers us an alternative vision in which pleasure is recognized as an essential part of the human condition and as a legitimate path to happiness and transcendence. Thus, lust in ancient Egypt should not be seen simply as an exotic or curious aspect of this civilization, but as a profound manifestation of its philosophy of life, its spirituality, and its integrated vision of the human being as body and soul, pleasure and responsibility, mortality and eternity. At the heart of the grandiose buildings of ancient Egypt, hidden between stone columns and guarded by rows of loyal soldiers, there were reserved spaces that few were allowed to enter, the royal harems. These were not just havens dedicated to pleasure, but true political and social institutions that exerted a silent but decisive influence on the course of the longest-lasting empire of antiquity. When we mention the word harem, it is inevitable that images of luxurious and permissive environments come to mind, populated by women of stunning beauty and surrounded by perfumes, silks, and jewels. In the Egyptian context, these elements were indeed present, but the function of the harem went far beyond the mere sexual satisfaction of the pharaoh. It was, above all, a space for political articulation, dynastic perpetuation, and paradoxically, for seclusion and imprisonment. The Great Royal Harem, or Perkenna as it was known, brought together women from various corners of the empire and even from foreign lands. Many of them were princesses sent as part of diplomatic alliances, while others were concubines chosen for their beauty, skills, or noble origin. There were also servants, dancers, musicians, and craftswomen who, even in subordinate roles, participated in the complex workings of this institution. For these women, entering the harem meant a radical change in their lives. Some, by becoming the pharaoh's preferred concubines or giving birth to a son, rose socially, gaining privileges and wealth. Others, however, found themselves relegated to anonymity, living in the shadow of more favored rivals. Internal competition was fierce and often involved cunning strategies, from silent poisoning to larger-scale conspiracies capable of altering the line of succession. Motherhood was the main route to advancement. A woman who bore a male heir could rise from being a mere concubine to the position of great royal wife, a title that, in addition to prestige, conferred political and economic influence. Such changes in status often led to tensions that culminated in betrayals and palace tragedies. The history of Egypt itself is dotted with emblematic examples, such as that of Queen Tiye, mother of Akhenaten, who, although coming from a non-royal lineage, climbed to the highest echelons of power thanks to her intelligence and political skill. The harem environment was at once opulent and claustrophobic. Decorated with richly colored murals, fragrant gardens, and crystal-clear fountains, it offered a setting of almost unreal beauty. However, the women confined there lived under the strict supervision of the eunuchs and harem administrators, who watched over the order and purity of the concubines. Freedom was an illusion. Every movement, every word could be interpreted as a threat or an opportunity in the silent game for power. In addition to being a physical space, the harem was also a cultural center where artistic skills and aesthetic refinements were cultivated. Women were trained in music, dance, poetry, and etiquette, skills that were essential to please the pharaoh and to stand out from the crowd. Dance, in particular, played a central role, often charged with eroticism and used as an instrument of seduction. However, it was not a vulgar pleasure, it was rather a subtle ritual, a choreography in which body, art, and desire intertwined. The rituals performed in the harem went beyond entertainment. Many of them had a religious and symbolic character. For example, dances dedicated to Hathor, goddess of love and fertility, were performed by some concubines as a way of ensuring divine protection and favoring the pharaoh's fertility. Such practices, which today could be classified as erotic rituals, were deeply respected and integrated into the Egyptian spiritual system. The sacred nature of sexuality in ancient Egypt is an aspect that cannot be overlooked. The sexual union between the pharaoh and his concubines was often perceived as a reflection of the creative act of the gods, especially the myth of Osiris and Isis, in which the resurrection and conception of Horus symbolized the perpetual renewal of the cosmos. Thus, the pharaoh's sexuality transcended personal pleasure. It was a religious and political duty, a means of ensuring the continuity and prosperity of Egypt. However, the harem was also a space where human sins were manifested in all their intensity. Jealousy, ambition, lust, and betrayal coexisted side by side. Competition between concubines often went beyond the limits of what was acceptable, and there are historical and literary records that indicate the practice of witchcraft and sorcery as instruments of elimination or seduction. Papyri containing charms and amulets intended to guarantee the love of the pharaoh or to harm a rival have been found by archaeologists, revealing the occult and mystical dimension of these disputes. The structure of the harem also reflected the social hierarchies of Egypt. Women of royal blood enjoyed greater privileges than concubines of common or foreign origin. This factor, however, did not prevent a woman of modest origin from rising, as long as she won the favor of the pharaoh or became the mother of an heir. The harem, therefore, was at the same time a space of confinement and a potential platform for power. Outside the confines of the harem, the rituals involving the pharaoh and his concubines also had a public and political character. Some religious festivals included the participation of the women of the harem in processions and celebrations dedicated to gods linked to fertility and royal power. These public appearances were not only demonstrations of devotion, but also of power and wealth, reinforcing the image of the pharaoh as absolute lord over the land and women. However, the harem was not always just a place of power and pleasure. In times of political instability, harems became epicenters of conspiracies and tragedies. A famous example is the so-called harem conspiracy, which occurred at the end of the reign of Ramses III in the 12th century BC. In this plot, one of the pharaoh's secondary wives, Tiye, orchestrated a plot to assassinate the king and place her son on the throne. The plan, however, was discovered and resulted in public trials, executions, and the decline of the empire's political stability. This episode clearly illustrates how harems were not only private spaces, but also political arenas where desire and ambition were inextricably intertwined. Seduction, motherhood, and even betrayal were legitimate tools in this game of power, and the women who inhabited these spaces played roles that were much more complex than the simple stereotype of passive or subjugated figures. At the same time, harems can also be seen as spaces of silent resistance. Many women, deprived of freedom and autonomy, found forms of expression and sublimation in art, literature, and religion. Some poems and songs composed by women of the harem have come down to us, revealing feelings of love, longing, frustration, and hope. These records are poignant testimonies to the humanity of these figures, often reduced to mere political or sexual instruments. Life in the harem, therefore, uniquely synthesized the themes of lust, sin, and spirituality that permeated all of Egyptian society. It was a microcosm where pleasure and power were confused, where desire was both a legitimate expression of human nature and a weapon in the struggle for survival and status. The reflection that emerges from this panorama is complex. On the one hand, the Egyptian harem can be seen as a space of oppression, where women were confined and used as currency of power. On the other, it was also an environment of female agency, where many managed to transcend their initial condition, exerting influence over political decisions and shaping the destiny of Egypt. Ultimately, the pharaoh's harem cannot be reduced to a simple den of pleasure or a gilded prison. It was, above all, a space where the multiple dimensions of human experience were manifested: desire, power, spirituality, ambition, love, and betrayal. Its existence and its complexity are eloquent testimony to the sophistication and contradictions of Egyptian civilization, whose integrated vision of life and sexuality still provokes and fascinates us today. Living in ancient Egypt meant living in a space where the sacred and the profane coexisted inseparably. The landscape was dominated by imposing temples, pyramids that touched the sky, and vibrant cities built on the banks of the Nile River, a vital artery that nourished not only the fields but also the soul of an ancient civilization. In this setting, life unfolded in a complex web of religious devotion, daily practices, celebration of pleasures, and, inevitably, sins that were not always perceived as transgressions. To understand how Egyptian life was structured, it is first necessary to understand the worldview of the ancient Egyptians. They believed in a highly structured cosmology, where the universal order called Ma'at had to be maintained at all costs. Ma'at represented not only justice and truth, but also cosmic harmony. Any violation of this order, whether a crime, a lie, or even an uncontrolled desire, was seen as a threat to the balance of the world. as the manifestation of chaos, or Isfet. On the other hand, Egyptian culture did not deny natural human impulses, such as lust, ambition, or pleasure. On the contrary, it recognized them as essential components of the experience of life. This duality between the need to maintain order and the inevitability of human desires created a complex ethical space in which lust, far from being repressed, was channeled and ritualized, often transforming into a sacred practice. The presence of the gods was omnipresent. Gods with human, animal, or hybrid forms populated the imagination and practical life of the Egyptians. The god Min, for example, was celebrated as the patron of male fertility and virility, often represented with an erect phallus, an unequivocal symbol of sexual potency and the generative capacity of nature. The cult of Min involved processions in which phallic symbols were carried through the streets in celebrations that mixed religious devotion and the exaltation of carnal pleasures. Hathor, in turn, was the goddess of love, beauty, and music. Festivals in her honor were marked by collective drinking, sensual dancing, and at times public sexual relations, all of which were considered legitimate forms of praise for the deity. The idea that pleasure and sensuality could be expressions of religiosity was central to understanding Egyptian life. Religious practices, therefore, were not restricted to silent meditation or prayer, but included rituals involving music, dance, wine, and even sex. These acts were not seen as sinful, but as necessary to maintain the favor of the gods and ensure the fertility of the land and women. Thus, sexuality was not only accepted, but integrated into the rites and daily life. The Egyptian home, especially among the wealthier classes, was a space where sensual pleasures were carefully cultivated. Private gardens were adorned with fruit trees and artificial lakes, where the owners could enjoy the company of family and guests, often at parties filled with wine and music. Clothing, made from the finest linen, was often tight and transparent, highlighting the body's shape and expressing an aesthetic that celebrated physical beauty. The use of cosmetics was widespread and not restricted to women. Men and women used eyeliner, perfumes, and oils to beautify themselves and seduce. The blue lotus, a symbol of regeneration, was also a powerful aphrodisiac, used both in rituals and in intimate life. The search for physical pleasure was thus a natural element of life, without the burden of guilt or moral condemnation. But not all was celebration and hedonism. Ancient Egypt was a rigidly hierarchical society, where power and wealth determined the scope of pleasures available. While nobles and royalty enjoyed harems, lavish feasts, and private temples, peasants and artisans lived a more austere life, although also marked by religious and community festivities that allowed moments of relief and pleasure. The role of women in Egyptian society was notably more autonomous than in many other ancient cultures. Women could own property, initiate legal proceedings, and above all, enjoy relative sexual freedom. It was not uncommon for women to choose their partners or to divorce. Monogamy was idealized, but polygamy, especially among the nobles, was widely practiced. Motherhood was highly valued, and the sexual act was deeply associated with the perpetuation of the family and social stability. However, sexuality was not restricted to the reproductive function. It was also experienced as a source of pleasure, beauty, and spiritual connection, as revealed by countless poems and inscriptions preserved on papyrus and tomb walls. Literary texts, such as the Book of the Wisdom of Ani, advised men on how to treat their wives and concubines, recommending respect and affection, but also recognizing the inevitable presence of jealousy and conflict. Love poems, such as those from the Ramesside period, extolled the physical desire and beauty of the beloved, using sensual metaphors and vibrant images of Egyptian nature. At the same time, sin in ancient Egypt was not conceived in the mold of later monotheistic religions. There was no demonic figure or eternal hell destined for transgressors. The judgment after death was based on the weighing of the heart. If it was lighter than the feather of Mart, the deceased was considered righteous and could access eternal life. Otherwise, he would be devoured by Amit, a hybrid and terrifying creature. This moral vision reveals a culture that, while valuing order and condemning acts of dishonesty, betrayal, or violence, did not see pleasure or lust as inherent or unforgivable flaws. What mattered was balance, the ability to live fully without violating social and cosmic harmony. Temples were not only religious centers, but also economic and cultural institutions. They administered vast lands, employed thousands of workers, and held festivals open to the public. On these occasions, wine, music, and dance flowed freely, creating an environment where social barriers were temporarily relaxed and life's pleasures were widely shared. However, beneath this vibrant facade, tensions and contradictions also lay hidden. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the elite created striking inequalities. Scribes and nobles enjoyed a comfortable life, while peasants, despite festive occasions, endured grueling workdays and deprivation. In addition, the practice of prostitution, although not officially sanctioned, was tolerated and widespread, especially in large cities such as Thebes and Memphis. Brothels operated discreetly, and many women engaged in prostitution as a means of survival. Some, however, associated themselves with religious cults, transforming themselves into hybrid figures between priestesses and courtesans, participating in fertility rituals where sex was considered a sacred offering. Ancient Egypt, therefore, presents itself as a civilization where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane were fluid, and where daily life reflected a mature and complex acceptance of human nature. Sins and virtues were not absolute categories, but dimensions of an existence that sought, above all, to maintain balance. This conception shaped not only religious and social practices, but also art, architecture, and even public policies. Egyptian laws, preserved in texts such as the Book of Instructions of Ptahhotep, emphasized the importance of justice and moderation, but rarely directly addressed the repression of sexual desires, unlike the legislation of neighboring cultures. The legacy of this vision endures to this day, fascinating historians, anthropologists, and the general public who come across a civilization that, instead of fearing or denying human impulses, sought to integrate them harmoniously into its philosophy of life. Ancient Egypt therefore teaches us that it is possible to conceive of a society where pleasure, spirituality, and order coexist, enriching the human experience and offering an alternative to the repressive moralism that marked other eras. Thus, living in ancient Egypt was to participate in an existential theater where gods and men mirrored each other, where sins were part of human nature, and where lust was not condemned but celebrated as a legitimate expression of life and creative power. A civilization that, by accepting the duality of its own essence, achieved an ethical, spiritual, and cultural sophistication that still inspires and intrigues today. However, beneath this vibrant facade, tensions and contradictions also lay hidden. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the elite created striking inequalities. Scribes and nobles enjoyed a comfortable life, while peasants, despite festive occasions, hardened grueling workdays and deprivation. In addition, the practice of prostitution, although not officially sanctioned, was tolerated and widespread, especially in large cities such as Thebes and Memphis. Brothels operated discreetly, and many women engaged in prostitution as a means of survival. Some, however, associated themselves with religious cults, transforming themselves into hybrid figures between priestesses and courtesans, participating in fertility rituals where sex was considered a sacred offering. Ancient Egypt, therefore, presents itself as a civilization where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane were fluid, and where daily life reflected a mature and complex acceptance of human nature. Sins and virtues were not absolute categories, but dimensions of an existence that sought above all to maintain balance. This conception shaped not only religious and social practices, but also art, architecture, and even public policies. Egyptian laws, preserved in texts such as the Book of Instructions of Ptahhotep, emphasize the importance of justice and moderation, but rarely directly address the repression of sexual desires, unlike the legislation of neighboring cultures. The legacy of this vision endures to this day, fascinating historians, anthropologists, and the general public who come across a civilization that, instead of fearing or denying human impulses, sought to integrate them harmoniously into its philosophy of life. Ancient Egypt therefore teaches us that it is possible to conceive of a society where pleasure, spirituality, and order coexist, enriching the human experience and offering an alternative to the repressive moralism that marked other eras. Thus, living in ancient Egypt was to participate in an existential theatre where gods and men mirrored each other, where sins were part of human nature, and where lust was not condemned but celebrated as a legitimate expression of life and creative power. A civilization that, by accepting the duality of its own essence, achieved an ethical, spiritual, and cultural sophistication that still inspires and intrigues today. A notable example of these occult practices is found in the erotic papyrus of Turin, one of the most explicit documents from antiquity. It depicts pornographic scenes, accompanied by inscriptions that, by all indications, had mystical or educational purposes. Although academic interpretations vary, many scholars agree that this papyrus highlights the naturalness with which the Egyptians viewed eroticism and its relationship with spiritual or ritualistic practices. In everyday life, eroticism also manifested itself in various ways, whether through literature, art, or hygiene and aesthetic habits. Egyptian love literature is rich in sensual metaphors, exalting the bodies, aromas, and gestures of lovers. Poems preserved in ostraca describe passionate encounters on the banks of the Nile, passionate kisses under the shade of palm trees, and caresses exchanged to the sound of flutes and lyres. These compositions not only reveal an appreciation for sensuality, but also bear witness to the importance of eroticism as a structuring element of emotional relationships. Personal aesthetics was another aspect in which eroticism was expressed on a daily basis. Men and women devoted themselves to taking care of their bodies with great care. They shaved, used exotic perfumes, applied oils and cosmetics, and wore clothes that highlighted their physical forms. The blue lotus, a sacred plant associated with renewal and fertility, was often used as an aphrodisiac and symbol of sexual desire. Marriage, although important to the social structure, was not the only space in which sexuality was experienced. Extramarital relationships, casual encounters, and even prostitution were tolerated in certain contexts, especially in large cities. Prostitution, for example, was not officially regulated, but it was widely practiced, often associated with religious cults or popular festivals. Some prostitutes were considered sacred women, performing ceremonial functions in fertility or sexual initiation rituals. This naturalization of sexuality did not, however, mean an absence of norms or limits. Adultery, for example, was considered a serious act, especially when committed by a woman against her husband, as it put the legitimacy of the offspring and consequently social stability at risk. However, among the upper classes, such transgressions were often relativized, especially when they involved political relations or strategic alliances. The concept of sin, as conceived in later religious traditions, did not exist in Egyptian culture in the same way. There was no radical opposition between sexual purity and impurity, nor a doctrine that condemned bodily pleasure as inherently sinful. What mattered was the preservation of Maat, the cosmic and moral order that governed all things. Thus, Practices that today would be considered sinful were, in ancient Egypt, seen as legitimate, as long as they did not violate social and spiritual harmony. Death, far from interrupting this relationship with eroticism, also perpetuated it. Many Egyptian tombs contain representations of banquets, dances, and scenes of pleasure, suggesting the desire for such experiences to continue in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that, in the afterlife, they could eternally enjoy earthly pleasures in an idealized existence in the fields of Osiris. The figure of the pharaoh synthesized this integration between eroticism and spirituality. As the representative of the gods on earth, the pharaoh was also the main mediator between the human and divine worlds. His sexual potency was seen as a reflection of his ability to maintain order and ensure the fertility of the kingdom. For this reason, many pharaohs kept large harems, and their virility was celebrated in inscriptions and monuments, reinforcing their image of absolute power. Egyptian architecture and art reflect this integrated conception of eroticism. Statues and reliefs depict nude or semi-nude bodies, not with pornographic intent, but as a celebration of the human form and its intrinsic beauty. Some images explicitly depict scenes of sexual union, especially in religious or funerary contexts, reinforcing the idea that sex was an integral part of the cosmic order and the continuity of life. The erotic secrets of ancient Egypt, therefore, were not secrets in the sense of clandestine or shameful practices, but rather natural and integrated aspects of the culture. What today might be interpreted as eroticism was, for the Egyptians, devotion, celebration of life, and communion with the divine. This challenging vision forces us to rethink modern conceptions of sexuality, sin, and spirituality. While many Western traditions associate bodily pleasure with sin and guilt, ancient Egypt offers us an alternative perspective, where eroticism is recognized as a legitimate and necessary part of the human experience and universal order. Thus, the erotic secrets of ancient Egypt are not mere vestiges of a distant culture, but vibrant testimonies of a civilization that knew, perhaps like no other, how to integrate pleasure and devotion, body and spirit, sensuality and transcendence. As we contemplate the majestic pyramids, the imposing sphinxes, and the obelisks that defy time, it is easy to see ancient Egypt as a civilization of order, harmony, and unshakable splendor. However, behind this official image, there is a hidden side, where lust, sexual magic, and decadence intertwined over the centuries, revealing a profoundly human society, vulnerable to the same passions and contradictions that mark any community. This hidden side of ancient Egypt manifests itself, first of all, through the practice of sexual magic, a tradition that, although rarely exposed in official records, had significant importance in the spiritual and daily life of the Egyptian people. It was believed that sexual energy was not just a biological impulse, but a cosmic force capable of generating, transforming, and destroying. Thus, specific sexual practices associated with magical rituals were performed with the aim of invoking the protection of the gods, ensuring fertility, seducing lovers, or even casting curses on enemies. Medical and magical papyri, such as the famous Ebers papyrus, contain formulas and recipes involving the use of aphrodisiac substances, amulets, and incantations designed to stimulate sexual desire or ensure the fidelity of a partner. In many of these rituals, masturbation and other sexual practices were seen as legitimate ways of manipulating supernatural forces. The myth of creation by the god Atum, who created life through an act of masturbation, provided the theological framework for such practices, giving them religious legitimacy. Another striking aspect of the occult side of Egypt was the existence of esoteric sects and cults that, outside the official religions, explored sexuality as a means of achieving altered states of consciousness and spiritual power. These practices, known only to a few initiates, combined eroticism with mysticism in a search for transcendence that necessarily involved the body and pleasure. The presence of phallic symbols in monuments, amulets, and statuettes highlights the importance attributed to sexuality as a vital and magical force. The god Min, often depicted with an erect phallus flanked by lettuce branches, a symbol of sexual vigor, was invoked in fertility rituals both to bless the fields and to ensure the virility of men. In these rituals, priestesses and priests played fundamental roles, often engaging in sexual performances that symbolically represented the union of the masculine and feminine principles, essential for the maintenance of cosmic order. However, this same cult of sexuality and pleasure sometimes ended up going beyond the limits of what was acceptable, slipping into moral and social decadence. During periods of political weakening, especially at the end of the New Kingdom and during the Third Intermediate Period, historical and archaeological accounts indicate an increase in the practice of rituals considered obscene or excessive, marked by orgies, unbridled alcohol consumption, and deliberate breaking of taboos. Accounts from the Greco-Roman period, when Egypt had already lost its political autonomy, describe with amazement and fascination the Dionysian festivals that took place in Alexandria and other cities, where the Egyptian tradition of sensual celebration was exacerbated to the point of self-destruction. Although these sources should be read with caution, they indicate a process of cultural decadence in which lust, previously ritualized and integrated into religious life, began to be experienced as a form of escapism in the face of the loss of identity and political power. This decline was not, however, an abrupt or homogeneous phenomenon. Throughout the long history of ancient Egypt, the balance between the celebration of sexuality and the maintenance of cosmic order varied according to the political, social, and religious contexts. During the reign of strong and centralizing pharaohs, such as Ramses II, sexual rituals maintained their symbolic and restricted character, controlled by the priestly elites. In periods of instability, such as at the end of the Middle Kingdom, hedonistic and magical practices became more common, fueled by despair and the desire for transgression. The occult side of Egypt is also manifested in the stories and legends of betrayal, conspiracies and murders that marked the pharaonic dynasties. The aforementioned harem conspiracy at the end of the reign of Ramses III is a classic example of this dynamic. Driven by political interests and human passions, the conspiracy involved one of the pharaoh's wives, Tiye, who, dissatisfied with her position in the harem, organized a complex plot to assassinate the king and place her son on the throne. The plan failed, resulting in the execution of dozens of conspirators, but it made clear how lust and ambition could become engines of decadence and ruin. The visual arts also record this hidden and erotic side of Egyptian culture. Mural paintings, reliefs, and statuettes frequently display nudes, explicit sexual positions, and phallic symbols, not as vulgar elements, but as an integral part of aesthetic and religious language. The Turin erotic papyrus, mentioned above, is perhaps the most famous example of this type of representation, containing scenes that, at first glance, might seem merely pornographic, but which, in the light of Egyptian culture, express the centrality of sex as a vital and magical force. The cult of the dead, a fundamental pillar of Egyptian religiosity, was also not exempt from erotic and magical components. Belief in life after death implied the need to maintain the integrity of the body, including the genitals, as a guarantee of the possibility of rebirth. Mummification, in this sense, was a ritual not only of preservation, but also of preparation for the continuation of vital and sexual functions in eternity. Some elite tombs, such as those in the Valley of the Kings, contain explicit representations of erotic scenes, indicating the desire of the deceased to continue enjoying the pleasures of the flesh in the afterlife. Another little-known aspect of this hidden side is the presence of practices that we could call punitive eroticism, used as a form of humiliation and social domination. In certain contexts, criminals or defeated enemies were iconographically represented in positions of sexual submission as a way of reinforcing their inferiority and the supremacy of the pharaoh or the ruling elite. These visual records, found in temples such as Medinet Habu, illustrate how eroticism could be instrumentalized not only for celebration and devotion, but also for symbolic and political violence. Ancient Egypt, therefore, reveals itself as a civilization that, while exuding a sophisticated spirituality and refined aesthetics, also harbored practices and beliefs marked by an erotic intensity that bordered at times on transgression and decadence. This hidden side, far from diminishing Egyptian splendor, gives it a human and complex dimension, challenging idealized or moralistic views of antiquity. The final decline of Egypt, which culminated in the Roman conquest in 30 BC, following the famous tragedy of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, can be interpreted, from a certain perspective, as the epilogue of a long process in which eroticism, sexual magic, and practices of luxury and excess ceased to be ordering forces and became symptoms of disintegration. The fusion between Egyptian and Hellenistic culture, especially in Alexandria, created a cosmopolitan and hedonistic environment, but also a vulnerable one, where the unbridled search for pleasure ended up eroding the foundations of national identity. Reflecting on this hidden side of Egypt is therefore to delve into the depths of a culture that recognized, without hypocrisy, the power of human desire, but which also faced, like all civilizations, the consequences of failing at times to balance this power with the imperatives of order and justice. In short, ancient Egypt has left us not only pyramids and monuments, but also an eloquent testimony of how lust and sexual magic can simultaneously be engines of creation and decadence. A legacy that invites us to reflect on the limits and possibilities of eroticism in social and spiritual life, not only in the past, but also in our present. Ancient Egypt is, without a doubt, one of the most complex and intriguing civilizations in human history. Far beyond the pyramids, obelisks, and grand royal tombs, there existed a web of secret rituals and forbidden fetishes, carefully hidden from the uninitiated eye. Practices that, although rarely described in official records, permeated the backstage of Egyptian religion, politics, and daily life, revealing a hidden side marked by taboos, unconfessed desires, and cults shrouded in mystery. The first step to understanding these forbidden rituals is to understand the highly symbolic nature of Egyptian culture. Every object, gesture, or word carried an esoteric meaning, and many rites were considered too sacred or dangerous to be revealed to the public. The priests, guardians of hidden knowledge, held a monopoly on these practices, transmitted orally or through encrypted texts, such as magical papyri and ritual manuals, intended only for the initiated. Among these secret rituals, those involving symbolic sexual practices stand out, used not as mere acts of pleasure, but as instruments of spiritual and political manipulation. The Egyptian belief in the correspondence between the human microcosm and the divine macrocosm meant that certain sexual practices were seen as capable of replicating primordial cosmic events on the earthly plane. Thus, carnal union could, in certain ritual contexts, be used to renew the universal order or to invoke supernatural forces. One of the most emblematic examples of these rituals was the so-called sacred masturbation of the pharaoh, performed annually during celebrations in honor of the creator god Atum. According to the texts of Heliopolis, Atum created the world from a masturbatory act, generating Shu, the air, and Tefnut, the moisture. To replicate and perpetuate this creative gesture, the pharaoh, as the living representative of the god on earth, performed the ritual on the banks of the Nile, ejaculating his seeds into the sacred waters to ensure the fertility of the soil and the continuity of the cosmic order. This act, far from being considered profane, was seen as essential for the balance of nature and the prosperity of Egypt. Another ritual deeply associated with sexual mysteries was the symbolic reenactment of the myth of Osiris, staged at the great festivals of Abydos. According to tradition, Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his brother Set, and later revived by his wife, Isis, who, when gathering the pieces of the god's body, could not find his penis and had to fashion an artificial phallus with which she conceived Horus. This narrative, which directly involves sexual and fertility elements, was celebrated publicly through processions and ceremonies, but also in a more private manner, in secret rituals where priests and priestesses symbolically enacted divine sexual union as a way of ensuring the cyclical renewal of life. Ritualistic sexual practices, however, were not restricted to official circles. Several records indicate the existence of magical rituals performed by ordinary individuals, especially women, with the aim of conquering or bewitching romantic partners. Papyri containing love spells or sexual impotence spells have been found in several Egyptian locations, such as Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans in Thebes. These spells, which often involved the use of bodily fluids, hair or nails of the desired person, were performed in secret, often with the help of specialized witches. The use of amulets of a sexual nature was also part of these magical and fetishistic practices. Phallic statuettes, representations of the god Bez with grotesque and explicitly erotic features, and talismans with magical inscriptions were used both to protect against evil forces and to stimulate sexual desire or ensure fertility. The presence of these objects in funerary contexts suggests that the Egyptians believed that sexuality did not cease with death, but continued to play a role in the afterlife, ensuring the deceased not only spiritual reproduction, but also the ability to enjoy sensory pleasures in eternity. Among the most curious fetishes of ancient Egypt is the veneration of certain animals associated with sexuality and fertility. The goddess Bastet, for example, was represented in the form of a cat, an animal that symbolized sensuality, independence, and mystery. The cult of Bastet involved exuberant festivals, marked by sensual dances and erotic offerings, often performed by women who acted as priestesses and at the same time living incarnations of the goddess. Cats were treated as sacred animals, and their death was a cause for deep mourning. The connection between felines and eroticism was not limited to religious symbolism, but also permeated the popular imagination, as indicated by numerous artistic representations of women with feline attributes or associated with cats. Another animal with erotic and magical connotations was the Apis bull, worshipped in Memphis as a symbol of sexual power and fertility. The selection of the Apis bull involved rigorous criteria, and its death was followed by complex rituals that aimed to ensure the perpetuation of its vital energy. Processions in its honor displayed phallic objects and were accompanied by dances and music of a strongly sensual nature. The dancers and musicians who participated in these rituals played an ambivalent role in Egyptian society. While admired for their skill and beauty, they were often associated with seduction practices and secret rituals that mixed eroticism and religiosity. The so-called dancers of God performed choreographies that in many cases simulated sexual acts as a way of invoking the forces of fertility or honoring deities such as Hathor and Bastet. In the private sphere, fetishes and erotic practices took on varied forms. Papyri containing instructions on sexual positions and ways to increase pleasure are evidence of the Egyptians' concern with exploring and valuing eroticism in a conscious and pleasurable way. A notable example is the existence of mural paintings in tombs and houses that represent intimate scenes of couples, not with the intention of scandalizing, but of celebrating love, desire, and the continuity of life. Even more enigmatic are the practices associated with necromancy and the use of corpses in magical rituals, an obscure and rarely discussed facet of Egyptian occultism. Although there are no official records that prove the systematic existence of ritual necrophilia, some Greek accounts and apocryphal texts mention practices in which parts of corpses were used in highly powerful spells, including rituals designed to ensure eternal love or revenge after death. The transgression of sexual taboos is also present in Egyptian mythological and literary records. The myth of Set and Horus, in which Set attempts to sexually humiliate his nephew Horus as a way of usurping the throne, is a notorious example of how sexual symbolism could be used as an instrument of political and social domination. Although the attempt failed, the episode highlights the Egyptians' awareness of the destructive and transformative power of sex, not only as a creative force, but also as a weapon of subjugation. The forbidden rituals and secret fetishes of ancient Egypt, therefore, constitute a fascinating and little-explored dimension of this civilization, challenging modern conceptions of morality, eroticism, and religiosity. For the Egyptians, sexuality was not a separate sphere of spiritual life, but one of its most powerful and effective expressions. This integration between the sacred and the erotic, between ritual and fetish, reveals a society that knew how to deal with the deepest and most instinctive forces of human nature, channeling them sometimes towards creation and celebration, sometimes towards magic, manipulation, and, in certain cases, domination and transgression. Reflecting on these hidden aspects of ancient Egypt also means confronting our own conceptions and prejudices about eroticism and spirituality. Recognizing that long before monotheistic religions imposed a repressive and moralizing vision of sexuality, there already existed a civilization that knew how to integrate, with sophistication and complexity, pleasure, desire, and transcendence. When one thinks about the political structure of ancient Egypt, it is common to imagine pharaohs ruling with an iron fist, leading armies, erecting colossal monuments and venerating the gods. However, behind the palace walls, in reserved and strictly guarded wings, another theatre of power was developing: the royal harems. Spaces filled with women, children, and servants, where lust, motherhood, politics, and intrigue intertwined in a complex tangle of relationships that shaped not only personal destinies, but the course of Egyptian history itself. At the center of this universe was the pharaoh, a deified man whose sexual power was a symbol of his authority and the stability of the empire. His duty was not limited to governing. He had the sacred obligation to produce heirs and ensure the continuity of the dynastic lineage. For this reason, the harem was not merely a space for personal pleasure, but a strategic state institution, composed of royal wives, concubines of different origins, foreign princesses sent as part of diplomatic alliances, and a multitude of servants, eunuchs, and tutors. The harem, or perkena as it was called, was a microcosm of the empire. The women closest to the pharaoh, especially the great royal wife, held considerable influence, participating in religious ceremonies, acting as political advisors, and in many cases, regents during the minority of their children. Other, less favored women sought to rise in the internal hierarchy through beauty, their ability to please the sovereign, or above all, through motherhood. Bearing a son for the pharaoh was the most direct route to personal advancement and security, as it conferred status and protection on both mother and child. However, This silent struggle for power transformed the harem into a battlefield disguised under veils of fine linen and exotic perfumes. Intrigues flourished amidst the seemingly idyllic routine. Concubines plotted against rivals. Mothers instructed their sons to position themselves as possible successors. Eunuchs conspired with and against their female charges. The harem, therefore, was less a place of passive contemplation and more an active stage, where alliances were formed and betrayals were hatched. One of the most famous episodes involving harem intrigue occurred at the end of the reign of Ramesses III in the 12th century BCE. Known as the harem conspiracy, the plot was led by one of the pharaoh's secondary wives, who sought to place her son Pentor on the throne to the detriment of the legitimate heir. The conspiracy involved members of the royal guard, priests, and palace servants. Although the assassination attempt on the pharaoh failed, there is some debate as to whether Ramses III died as a result of the plot or survived for some time. The episode resulted in one of the most dramatic trials in antiquity, culminating in the execution or forced suicide of the conspirators. This case illustrates how the harem, far from being an isolated and innocuous stronghold, was a pulsating center of influence and political risk. Diplomatic alliances shaped by lust were also crucial elements in Egyptian politics. During the New Kingdom, it was common for foreign kings to send their daughters to the pharaoh's harem as a way of securing peace and sealing treaties. These diplomatic marriages had far-reaching geopolitical implications. A paradigmatic example was the sending of a Mitannian princess to marry Pharaoh Amenhotep III, sealing the alliance between Egypt and the Kingdom of Mitanni. This union not only consolidated peace between the two empires, but also strengthened Egypt's position in the region, guaranteeing access to trade routes and strategic resources. Despite their political function, harems were also spaces marked by sensuality and the cult of beauty. Women were prepared from a very young age to charm and satisfy the pharaoh. They received refined education in music, dance, poetry, and etiquette. They were taught to use cosmetics, to dress in transparent linen, and to cultivate the art of seduction. Eroticism was a tool, but also an aesthetic ideal and a means of social advancement. The presence of eunuchs in the harem was essential to maintaining order and discipline. Castrated while still young, they were the guardians and administrators of the space, ensuring that the women remained faithful to the pharaoh and that no outside men had access to the harem. However, historical accounts indicate that the rules were not always followed to the letter. There is evidence of cases of adultery and scandals involving illicit relations between concubines and members of the court, or even with the eunuchs themselves, suggesting that despite the strictness, human desire often escaped the control of institutional structures. Egyptian art also reflects the centrality of lust and the harem in the life of the pharaoh. Mural paintings, reliefs, and statuettes depict scenes of banquets, dances, and erotic offerings, showing that pleasure was not a marginal element but essential to palace life. The pharaoh, often portrayed surrounded by women and musicians, appears as the personification of abundance and sexual potency, attributes that reinforced his political legitimacy and his connection with the gods. The cult of the goddess Hathor, protector of love, music, and joy, was deeply linked to life in the harem. Priestesses of Hathor, often drawn from the ranks of the harem, led rituals marked by sensual dances and songs, reinforcing the association between sensuality and spirituality. These practices transcended mere entertainment. They were gestures of devotion, instruments of mediation between the human and the divine. Children born into the harem played an ambivalent role. On the one hand, they were seen as potential heirs and were therefore educated with rigor, receiving military, administrative, and religious instruction. On the other, they were pieces on a political chessboard used to form alliances, reinforce the pharaoh's authority or, in some cases, eliminated or marginalized to avoid dynastic disputes. Competition between the sons of different concubines further fueled intrigue, with mothers encouraging conspiracies and alliances to ensure the future of their descendants. Although the institution of the harem played a central role in the political and social structure of ancient Egypt, it was not without criticism and reflection. Some literary texts, such as the Instructions of Ptahhotep, warned about the dangers of uncontrolled lust, emphasizing the need for moderation and respect for Ma'at, the cosmic and moral order that sustained the Egyptian universe. The exaltation of pleasure and sensuality, therefore, coexisted with an ethical awareness of the risks of unbridled ambition and excessive passions. Over the centuries, the Egyptian harem model influenced other cultures and civilizations, being reinterpreted and adapted in many ways. However, its uniqueness lies in the way it combined lust, politics, and spirituality in the same institution. The harem was not just a space of female confinement, but a laboratory of power, where motherhood, eroticism, and intrigue shaped the destiny of the empire. The analysis of Egyptian harems therefore reveals the importance of understanding sexuality and lust, not only as private aspects of life, but as structuring elements of social and political institutions. In ancient Egypt, pleasure and power went hand in hand, intertwined in a complex dance that spanned millennia and left indelible marks on the history of humanity. Ultimately, the harems of ancient Egypt are eloquent testaments to the human capacity to transform desire into an instrument of social and political construction. They illustrate how lust, far from being a mere personal whim, can become a force that shapes empires, capable of generating alliances, provoking wars, inspiring art and literature, and, above all, defining the course of an entire civilization. Ancient Egypt is, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the most impressive examples of a civilization that, over millennia, managed to combine political power, religiosity, and a rich material culture. However, like all historical powers, its trajectory culminated in a decline marked by a silent but inevitable process in which the forces that once drove its splendor began to corrode its very foundations. And among these forces, few were as insidious as the combination of lust, the desire for power, and the sins that arose when excess replaced virtue. From the dawn of Egyptian civilization, power was conceived as a direct manifestation of divine will, and the pharaoh, as the representative of the gods on earth, was the absolute holder of this power. However, as the centuries passed, the nature of this power became progressively more personalized, detached from the ideal of Ma'at, the principle of balance and justice, and more oriented towards individual whims, especially in the field of sensory pleasures. The harem, which previously served as a political instrument of dynastic perpetuation and international alliance, transformed itself at certain times into a center of unbridled hedonism. The multiplication of concubines and illegitimate children generated chronic succession confusion, fueling internal rivalries and civil wars that considerably weakened the Egyptian state. The pharaohs of the late New Kingdom, particularly those of the 19th and 20th dynasties, are classic examples of this process of degeneration. Ramses II, although celebrated as a great builder and military strategist, maintained a vast harem that produced dozens of sons and daughters. The dispute over succession, although skillfully managed by Ramses, sowed the seeds for the political crises that followed. But it was with the less capable successors that central power began to fragment. Pharaohs such as Merneptah, Siptah, and Ramses III found themselves embroiled in palace intrigues and conspiracies, such as the aforementioned harem conspiracy, in which the combination of lust, ambition, and betrayal culminated in an assassination attempt and the execution of high-ranking members of the court. This conspiracy, motivated by the desire of one of the secondary wives to secure the throne for her son, reveals how the excess of women in the harem and the absence of a clear succession policy created permanent instability. What had previously been a symbol of the pharaoh's power and fertility became a catalyst for fratricidal disputes and civil wars. At the same time, lust and hedonism began to dominate not only the court, but also the upper echelons of the priestly class. The clergy of Amun, based in Thebes, accumulated such great economic and political power that at times it rivaled the pharaoh himself. Priests, who were supposed to be models of virtue and moderation, indulged in corrupt practices, extreme luxury, and, according to some records, private sexual rituals, which became less sacred rites and more instruments of personal pleasure. This departure from the ideal of Ma'at did not go unnoticed by Egyptian scribes and intellectuals. During the so-called period of transition, which followed the collapse of the New Kingdom, texts known as lamentation literature multiplied, in which anonymous scribes or officials expressed their regret for the state of decadence of society, attributing the crisis to the loss of ethical values, the corruption of rulers, and above all, the prevalence of luxury and hedonism over duty and virtue. One of these texts, dating from the Third Intermediate Period, reads, "The great are fallen, the small are exalted. Gold is more esteemed than justice, and the pleasures of the flesh have become the office of the noble." This type of criticism demonstrates how the perception of moral decadence was directly associated with Egypt's political and economic decline. While Egypt was corroding internally, the empire suffered the consequences of this weakness externally. Foreign peoples, previously contained by Egyptian military force, such as the Libyans and the Sea Peoples, began to invade and settle in Egyptian lands. The successive invasions and the fragmentation of power resulted in the division of Egypt into several independent kingdoms, ruled sometimes by local dynasties and sometimes by foreign invaders. Another factor that contributed to Egypt's decline was the distortion of religious rituals, many of which were originally associated with the celebration of fertility and cosmic order, but which, over time, became mere pretexts for hedonistic feasts and excesses. The festivals dedicated to Hathor and Min, once vibrant manifestations of popular religiosity, came to be criticized as occasions for drunkenness, uncontrolled lust, and licentiousness. Foreigners who visited Egypt during this period, such as the Greeks, were fascinated and scandalized by reports of these celebrations. Herodotus, in his historical account, describes with astonishment the Egyptian festivals, especially those dedicated to Bastet at Bubastis, where crowds indulged in wine, music, and provocative dancing while sailing down the Nile in festive boats. Although Herodotus wrote centuries after Egypt's heyday, his accounts indicate how the perception of Egypt as a place of excess and decadence took hold. With the arrival of the Assyrians, Persians, and later the Greeks, Egypt definitively lost its political autonomy, becoming a province subordinate to foreign powers. The famous Queen Cleopatra VII, the last sovereign of the Ptolemaic dynasty, tried in vain to restore Egypt's greatness, but her own public image was often associated with lust and seduction. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony not only left their mark on the popular imagination, but also reinforced the idea that lust and power were intimately intertwined in Egypt's ultimate destiny. Cleopatra knew how to use her intelligence and charisma as political weapons, but the narrative constructed by the Roman victors, especially through the propaganda of Octavian, the future Augustus, transformed her figure into a symbol of Oriental decadence, the ultimate personification of the sin that had supposedly corrupted and overthrown Egypt. However, it would be a mistake to reduce the fall of Egypt solely to the factor of lust. What history suggests is that lust when dissociated from the regulative principle of Maat, became one of the most evident symptoms of an empire that had lost its capacity for self-limitation and renewal. Excess, both in pleasure and in the concentration of power, contributed to internal disorganization and external vulnerability, accelerating a process of decline that, although inevitable, could have had a less tragic outcome. Thus, the history of ancient Egypt offers us a timeless lesson on the dangers of the imbalance between power, pleasure, and responsibility. Lust, which at other times was a vital and creative element, a symbol of fertility, life, and cosmic order, was transformed in the final decadence into a factor of disorder and self-destruction. Ultimately, the sin that brought down Egypt was not lust per se, but the inability to subordinate individual desires to the collective good, to balance pleasure with virtue, and to contain power within the limits of justice and order. This lesson, inscribed in the ruins of temples, in the texts of lamentation, and in the legends of pharaohs and queens, remains an eloquent warning about the risks of any society that abandons balance in favor of excess. Egypt, which for centuries knew how to transform sexuality and fertility into symbols of life and eternity, succumbed in its final phase to what could be called a moral entropy, in which hedonism replaced transcendence and the excessive search for power and pleasure corroded the foundations of civilization. Over the centuries, the image of ancient Egypt has been etched into the memory of humanity as a symbol of grandeur, mystery, and eternity. Its colossal temples, its challenging pyramids, and its gods with hybrid forms still fascinate millions today. But behind the carved stone, the buried gold, and the hieroglyphics that have stood the test of time, there is a pulsating and deeply human truth. Egypt was not only an empire of glory, it was also a civilization of desires, internal conflicts, secret sins, and unconfessed lusts. In this extensive and disturbing delve into Egyptian sexuality, rituals, harems, and intrigues, we understand that pleasure and power walked side by side in the shadows and in the palaces. Lust, which in moments of balance functioned as a channel to the divine and a symbol of vitality, was also the silent ferment of intrigues, betrayals, and collapses. The history of Egypt teaches us that no civilization is above human nature, and that is precisely where its greatest lesson lies. Greatness does not lie in denying desires, but in knowing how to control them, channel them, and harmonize them with the greater order. The concept of sin in Egypt was not absolute but relational. It was linked to the breakdown of Maat, the universal balance, and this invites us to think about our own time. How many times, in the name of progress, pleasure, or power, have we abandoned balance? How many modern civilizations, with all their technology and arrogance, repeat the same mistakes of the pharaohs who got drunk on luxury, ignoring the signs of collapse that were lurking? When we look at the Egyptian past, we do not only see enigmatic figures or divine kings, we see ourselves. With our passions, our secrets, our ambitions, and above all, with the same eternal dilemma: how to live fully without destroying ourselves. The moral that ancient Egypt leaves us with is clear. Glory built on unbridled pleasure and boundless greed is like desert sand, beautiful from a distance but unstable underfoot. The true empire is one that is sustained by virtue, wisdom, and balance. And perhaps, in rediscovering the sins and lusts of this civilization, we are in fact rediscovering our own reflections in the mirror of eternity. Thank you for watching this video. We ask that you subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, turn on the notification bell to be notified of our posts. Until the next video.